Hey everyone, from the great American Northwest, I bid you all good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. My name is Leah Prime, and this is the Invisible Night School. We are back after, after a hiatus for me. I know the gentlemen here were happily filling in the hot seat, hosting some great conversations. But for anyone just joining us, we are the Invisible Night School. We're a small consortium of lay researchers and scholars pursuing the study and exploration of ufology, high strangeness, and the phenomena. INS is not a monolith. We represent varied ideas, backgrounds, disciplines, experiences, and seek to engage in good faith conversation with other curious minds. This evening, we're going to be discussing the subject of disclosure. We don't have a guest slated for tonight. Instead, it's going to be two of my lovely co-hosts. We have the inimitable Campbell Morera joining us. Campbell.
Hello.
And then, of course, our resident dubious layman, Nick. Good to have you.
Hey, how's it going?
Hi, Nick. You are looking every bit the UFO researcher in your Hawaiian shirt, vaguely disheveled, the cat on your lap. It's perfect.
Who's disheveled?
That beauty computer behind you.
Yeah. I know the computer's
all coming together.
Straight for it brings you right to the BBS.
I've got a little CRT back there with a VCR hooked up too. This is kind of like
incredible.
A low-tech room right here.
Yes, Simon Fly bearing their lead right here.
Yes.
It's what is it? It's bait. There's no disclosure, right?
True. Well, it depends on what you mean. Like disclosure of what. And that actually is kind of how I want to start it off.
Yes.
I don't want to say because I wanted to kind of touch on where we're all at, like what all our takes are on UFOs and ufology, and eventually disclosure too. But I don't want to say what are UFOs, because that's kind of like saying, in my opinion, where are lost socks? It's a bit of a similar question. But that kind of brings me to it. And I want to talk about what ufology is to each of you and to me. And kind of more interestingly, why is ufology? Why is there a ufology?
Right.
So I'm gonna kick that off. So what and why is ufology, Campbell?
Yeah, well, ufology, going off the top of my head here, it's the study of UFOs as a subject. If we look at the most recent article by McWest in, what is that paper? The New York Post, I believe he published it.
It was the Post.
Defines the ufology as the study of UFOs as extraterrestrial objects or craft or whatever. I thought that was interesting. It sort of refines it. Also, a lot of people who study UFOs would be upset with that because it leaves out the humans that are interdimensional visiting us and time traveling humans. It's not just extraterrestrials here, right?
Sure.
But generally speaking, I think ufology is like the study of this distinct category of object, kind of in line with what Mick was saying, like that people have been reporting seeing for decades and decades now. What about you, Leah? What do you think of?
Oh man, there's so much I could say. I'm always reminded of Noam Chomsky talking about the phrase "support our troops" and this idea that phrase itself. Well, no, I'm gonna get there, Nick.
Oh no, I'm
calm down.
Oh.
Everyone loves your shirt, man.
Yeah, people are really digging it.
You are dressed to kill for the part. But like no, people aren't making fun of you. They love you. Anyway, I always think of that Noam Chomsky quote about basically how this phrase "support our troops" is basically this completely meaningless, useless phrase that can be contorted and applied to basically anyone of any ideology, any place, because who doesn't support the troops, right? And I say this because I think when we fall into discussing like what exactly defines ufology, we wind up with these extremely literal definitions that completely fail to account for the complexity and nuance and sort of like qualitative elements or subjective elements of the subject. And these really these extremely literal definitions basically fail to account for the subject in any appreciable way, in my opinion. But I also think exactly like what Campbell said, when we talk about this subject, there are definitely basically niches and sub niches within the entire subject. Very nice. I have a seltzer. Um, but niches and sub niches within this subject that, in a very general, broad sense, fall into the subject of ufology, but could very just as much be considered psychedelia, meditation, spiritual emergence. There's this variety of human experiences that don't fall strictly into the nuts and bolts or material phenomena that we hear people talk about. And I think it also reminds me of seeing people say things like UFOs are real, right? Like this is a completely meaningless and vacuous statement because, of course, there are literal UFOs. There are things we see that
Sure.
people see that cannot literally be identified. But what does that actually mean, right? Like, what does this notion of, yes, UFOs are real? What does this actually imply from an ontological and epistemological perspective? And of course, that necessitates us to even have some shared consensus understanding of what UFOs even are.
Right. So
So are they just flying saucers, Nick?
Pre-1947, I mean, like throughout history, we've been seeing things in the sky that we can't recognize. The Phantom airships, the Ghost rockets in 1946, Foo Fighters during the war, but they were never.
I mean, shit, even stuff documented over Nuremberg in the 16th century. There's all sorts of this stuff. Yeah.
But these were all kind of collected into a general unknown kind of Forteana, right? Actually, it was the Forteans who were like the proto-ufologists.
The Forteans, not the Freudians.
Right.
Important distinction.
But then after 1947, it kind of was recategorized as its own thing, although I can't point to a specific like characteristic or trait that's a criteria to become a UFO, opposed to like we were talking to Michael Huntington and I asked him like what's the distinction between a spook light and a UFO? And I wonder why you guys think that what was it about 1947 that kind of recategorized it and kind of essentially created what we understand as ufology now?
I just want to address a question from one of the viewers right now. V asks, I've heard the word Fortean before, but what's it mean? It's basically an adjective reference to Charles Fort, who wrote the Book of the Damned and who studied a lot of the sort of strange, paranormal, etc. Totally worth checking out. You can get his books on Amazon for super, super inexpensive, but I sort of think of him as the pioneer of modern paranormal studies or weird studies. Everything from telekinesis, clairvoyance, clairaudience, mediumship, poltergeist activity, raining frogs, any of this kind of stuff. Totally worth checking out.
If you were like kind of in a nutshell, what he thought that these like anomalies or mysteries of science and stuff like that all kind of came from it's where I told you your ring was from, and I can't remember. It's the super something C. It's essentially a concept.
The Super Sargasso Sea.
Yes,
that's what he swallowed up my engagement ring. Yes.
So, but this concept is something that we saw when we talked way back in like episode 4 about ghosts. It's essentially a reinterpretation of the ether, which is actually a medieval idea. So this idea that we now kind of, I see people talk about consciousness in the same way, but also the extra dimensional hypothesis are all kind of this same recycled concept from medieval times of the ether, this kind of like parallel other space, like a space parallel to ours that they come in and out of. And it's interesting that predated the ETH essentially. Aside, I say that some of the Forteans under Fort kind of proposed the ultra-dimensional hypothesis too, but it seems to, it's so murky around then because you had people like Mead Lane who were doing the channeling thing, which also echoes the spiritualism that we talked about before. But then you had what's his name, Ray Palmer, who was writing Amazing Stories, basically writing out the UFO narrative that exists today, essentially the X-Files plot line that these are craft with extraterrestrials and the government knows about it and is hiding knowledge. I mean, he was writing this back in 1946, so prior to 1947. But what is it? I asked this a minute ago. What was it about that year, or was it even the Kenneth Arnold sighting that kind of recategorized this? Like, what do you think?
Well, wait, I just want to sidecar on something you brought up about this idea of the emergence in the medieval period of this like other world or other reality, right?
Yeah.
This is very much so, like when we look at it's sort of, and I'm just gonna go a little bit off the cuff here, but it sort of reminds me about discussions of low versus high Christology, right? When you read the really early gospels about Christ, they're very like nuts and bolts. There's nothing metaphysical or woo-woo about them. They're just like, dude got nailed to a cross, died after 3 days. That was kind of it. When you read like some of the later gospels, that's when you start seeing a lot more of this sort of metaphysical or mysterious or numinous quality associated with the death and resurrection of Christ, and also the sort of symbolism that's associated with this, right? This is when like the story of like the dove comes out. And I bring this up because so much, particularly the medieval Christian experience, was imbued with a lot of these sort of mystical preoccupations. And then also, you see this show up in a lot of like medieval art and in the Roman Catholic Church, which was sort of the overarching body working on defining Christianity. And we see, and there's all these different artifacts that are supposedly imbued with this sort of metaphysical or divine power just by virtue of being around Christ. And this, I think, both from a theological perspective and institutional perspective, like within the realm of the Catholic Church itself, but then also for the followers of the church, the laity, this idea of like, the spear of destiny, quote unquote, the spear that was used to pierce Christ's side, the shroud of Turin, the different relics, either Christ's relics, like pieces of the cross, or saints' relics, like bones and hearts and shit like that. Like this very much introduced into popular consciousness, this idea that there is this sort of other world, that even if we can't physically engage with it and interact with it, what we can do is we can use these sort of divine artifacts, again, through the Catholic Church. Obviously, like indigenous and witchcraft and stuff are also doing this kind of thing much more surreptitiously, but you can use these artifacts as basically prisms or gateways into encountering or understanding or peering into the divine or the sort of alternate reality that exists. And I feel like when we think about what sort of primed the Western modern mind for this kind of thinking, like we have the medieval period, and I mean, even we have like Wagner and Parsifal and The Ring and stuff. Like Parsifal is all about this stuff, and that was like one of the main cultural icons at the end of the 19th century, bringing these ideas into common kind of consciousness, along with like romantic nationalism and things like that. But anyway, that's what I was thinking of when we think about how sort of the common mind becomes primed to accept and engage with these ideas of non-physical reality being around us, and occasionally also affecting our physical realities, right? This is why people pray to relics or pray for intercession of the saints to do things in our physical reality on our behalves.
And I think it's worth noting too, like the idea of the ether, the Ethereum. It's the domain of light, of goodness from the biblical belief system. And these beings from the Ethereum are luminous beings. Light is good. They are pure goodness. They're pure light. People were committing to these things because they were seeing things that they couldn't understand or explain. Seeing meteors coming down, that's a classic example. You see a group of meteors, a slow falling because they're coming at a steep angle. You wouldn't know what that was. They would look potentially like beings, if you've been told that they're angels and they're from the Ethereum, they're pure luminosity, and perhaps that's the origin of that description, right? So these things emerge, and then you want a description of it, and then you appeal to your standards of reference from your community,
right?
So there is sometimes a foundation to these things as well.
Maybe the criteria that qualifies ufology moving forward from Forteana is because, unlike other things that you don't have a good look at, you can go up and examine, but UFO sightings are by definition out of reach and fleeting, kind of. So it perpetuates the mystery. Moving to quickly answer the question I put out to you about 1947, I think it's all in the branding. I think the mistaken press report calling them flying saucers is really what kind of made a.
It's a meme.
Yeah, it's a meme. It's
a meme.
It's like a jingle or a brand to put it all under, and I think that is why 1947 is an important date and kind of what spawned what we do now. To circle back, but what were you saying, Campbell?
Yes.
Just about there are observations that produce these stories, and just another form of observation from the Middle Ages would be something that Jacques Vallée, who is a famous ufologist, actually references in one of his most famous book titles, Passport to Magonia. Magonia is the other realm where the fairy folk take you when you pass out or whatever it is, and then it's also this idea of the castles in the sky, and that sounds like an absurd concept that a castle will be in the sky, but we've played the videos of the natural atmospheric effect, Fata Morgana. It's an atmospheric effect that causes light waves to move at a trajectory that brings them across the horizon, and then it makes distant objects appear to be floating. And you can produce very interesting effects that way. The image sometimes gets stacked up in a column, and it can look like a castle in the sky. And so there's a middle ground there where people are seeing these very strange things that they can't explain, but then there's folklore about what they actually think that they are, and then there's a consensus that's built from the origin of people actually seeing something very unusual, and then the larger group of people believing them, who they have close personal relationships, and expands, and then there comes a certain point when you actually have the capacity through a variety of mechanisms to investigate and verify what exactly that is that's occurring. And that's sort of a transformational thing. In the case of 47, Nick, is there a particular pivot other than just Kenneth Arnold that you're thinking of specifically that makes it so defining as a year?
Well, what was it? It was June 24th. He saw 9 objects that he described as skipping like saucers. I believe he said they were round in front with a convex triangle on the back. They were not circular, they were not discs, but he was a what everyone would even still call a reliable witness. He's a upstanding citizen. I think he was former military. Was he? I couldn't tell you. It's hard to say. Maybe it was just that right time. Maybe it was a summer fad that they call back then, summer silliness. But immediately after that, you had an enormous wave of people seeing discs, not only discs, but spinning discs usually, which is kind of you would naturally kind of come to the conclusion that they would just because they are round. But I don't know. It's interesting. One of the I think it was within a week, there was a case, the Maury Island case, which turned out to be a hoax, I believe, that he got himself involved with. And I think one of the people involved in that case was also contributing to Amazing Stories. Cool. I think he claimed to have fought the Darrow in a cave. The Darrow come from the Shaver Mysteries, which were essentially Palmer just kind of rewriting schizophrenic letters.
He would have been great on Twitter.
Yeah, I think that 1947. That was the year Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier, right?
Yep.
It was.
This is also when Roswell happened. You know, although but like Roswell didn't really enter sort of the cultural zeitgeist in a meaningful sense until the 80s, right? Yep. There's this great book on it, like The Myth of Roswell or something. It's not about denigrating the contents of the Roswell narrative, but rather to talk about how it emerged as an American myth or kind of shared cultural touchstone. Didn't really happen until the mid to late 80s. Yeah,
it was just one of many newspaper reports. The media really carried this story around, and I think that is kind of what took off. Because like I mentioned, the year before, I think in Scandinavia, there was a wave of ghost rocket sightings. But they're not necessarily considered the same thing. So I don't know. I think it was that snappy name really that did it.
Yeah, it's a meme. It's catchy, right? It's like a Burma Shave billboard or something. Right. People love it. And I mean, this is also, look, this is the other thing going on here too. We're going to sort of look at the broader kind of landscape, this is also a time, it's right after World War II. This is sort of the golden age of technology and the golden age of science fiction. This is back when things were still optimistic, right? We're not all living in this William Gibson hellscape. We're living in this like happy Fritz, like Fritz Lieber pleasure dome of like being saved by technology.
Yeah, the dystopia is yet to come.
The dystopia is yet to come. And there's also this, I think this also proclivity to see technology as a benevolent force that intervened on behalf of saving humanity, right? Like this is sort of the rah-rah American view after World War II.
Yeah, I think people had been accustomed to technological marvels at this point, and nothing that the UFOs did then, or I think do now, are necessarily outside of like the imagination of our near future.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like at the time, what were the the properties of a UFO besides it being a saucer was that they would move extremely quickly. I don't even think the odd maneuvers were necessarily common yet, just that they would take off essentially like a jet airplane.
Well, I was just going to jump in and say too, Jacques Vallée in Forbidden Science, that first volume, he talks about his sighting, and he sees a literal flying saucer. That's what he talks about. It's not an orb, it's not a cigar or rod, it is a flying saucer, and he observes it. And this is like early 1950s.
So is it would be kind of a leap, or at least a large coincidence that extraterrestrials start visiting us, the day after Kenneth Arnold has his sighting. And
dude, what are you talking about? They've been here for thousands of years.
Sure. Right. Always kind of mirroring us.
You think buried Atlantis? Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's a good point about the timing involved. There was so much paranoia after World War II. People were familiar with the fact that the German military and such had developed extremely advanced weaponry in the form of the rockets, the V1s, and especially the V2s. And
the Bell.
What's that, the Bell?
Sorry.
That's a conspiracy.
That's a big conspiracy, the Nazi Bell. Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that one.
It's
like the Antarctic bases
you've been
and such.
Staying, yeah, that's basically it. You've been staying on the nice part of the UFO internet.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a benefit and curse of me sort of jumping in from the science side. I don't have this rich history of the Nazi conspiracies.
Thinly veiled anti-Semitism permeating everything.
Yes. But yeah, so like the V2, and it was kind of a novel thing. Like the V2, it went so fast that it was silent until there was a sudden explosion in front of you. That was that had never been occurred historically, and people were completely blown away by just that on its own, that it's moving so fast, or the technology can produce something like that. And then we had the situation where the Soviets came in on the east, Allied powers came in on the west, and then we were snatching up all these scientists, especially in we got a bunch of the rocketry scientists. And the American government, we know from declassified documents, they were extremely worried about the idea that the Soviets had gotten enough scientists out of there that they now had a technological advantage in rocketry. And so when you see Sweden, the idea of these ghost rockets the next year in 46 prevalent, the thought was naturally, just like we saw last year, what was it, with the drones over the nuclear power plants in Sweden, instantaneously, it's our old enemy, Russia. The Swedish and Russian empires were enemies for centuries, and now they still are very tense. So, you got this long history. If you're speculating about the Soviets sort of being responsible for things that are more advanced than we've ever seen, and when you look at the declassified documents from the United States, that's what you see. You see them trying to define what it is that people are, the core residual that trusted people are seeing, and they're trying to ascertain, are these things coming from the Soviet Union? Do they exist fundamentally? Do they exist? If they do, are they Soviet technology?
That kind of leads us into, or at least a path towards, talking about disclosure here, and that's the government's involvement, specifically the U.S. government's involvement in a cover-up of this. Now, it seems to me now that there's a lot more government involvement in the UFO narrative, especially lately, or the past few years. But that story seems to have kind of changed, hasn't it? Right? Like all these secret Pentagon departments and stuff like that have no idea what UFOs are, and they're still researching them, right? So what is it that's being disclosed?
What is being disclosed? Well, very little.
What like hypothetically, ideally, what are they disclosing? Is it the alleged crash retrieval programs? But if these crash retrieval programs exist, why did something like Leah's muted? Why did something like ATIP exist after the fact? Or not ATIP, but OSAP or Arrow Now? Why do we have Arrow Now that's investigating these UFO sightings when we also in tandem have crashed ships?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one. I mean, it gets all wrapped up together, and there's so many conflicting elements. I think it's important or at least valuable for us to define roughly what disclosure means for anybody who's not familiar with the concept. Disclosure in the UFO community is it's almost like a judgment day of kinds, but like perceived in a positive way. But it's seen as this sort of inevitable thing in some of the portion of the community, a day when the government steps forward and admits or verifies that it's all been true. The abductions, the crash retrievals, the secret technology programs based on UFOs, that the aliens are here, depending on the exact narrative, the beliefs about the presidents of the United States conspiring with alien races over decades. So this disclosure day is verification of the suite of beliefs that the particular individual holds around UFOs. Oh, and we've lost Leah. She'll hopefully be back. Yeah, but yeah, Nick, what do you think of that? Does that? Yeah, she was muted. Does that sound about right to you? Here, I'll
yeah, sure. I mean, I suppose so.
Can you hear me now?
Exactly, you're on.
Yes.
Oh my God.
Yes, we can.
Finally.
So yeah, what has come from this, hidden knowledge that the government's had of either ET visitation or even crash retrievals? Do we have like technology to show for it? I've seen people kind of posit that fiber optic technology came from that, which
that was the big Philip Corso thing. Yeah, Philip Corso's Day After Roswell contended that like
I
we
think
got fiber optic technology and Wi-Fi,
which is
microcomputers like chips. Yeah.
So like we're using drones. I mean, we essentially understand how drones work. What was the benefit of this knowledge that they've kept secret so long that they have yet to disclose? Like, are we using it in wars and not seeing it? Are we flying over there in sports models? Like, what is this? What is this knowledge that they're hiding?
It's important.
It may not be explicit technological knowledge or information. It may be a broader sort of acknowledgement that we're not the top man on the totem pole, right? And that this is sort of viewed as an admission or an admission of weakness that leaves us profoundly exposed to harm or destruction, right? That's sort of the reason for not disclosing things. It's not about wartime technology. It's about sort of the broader shift in how we understand our place, not just on Earth, but literally in the universe.
I mean, you remember the pandemic, right? I mean, like, what was the general population's reaction?
You mean the plandemic, Nick?
Exactly. Exactly. So when I hear a lot of people say
YouTube is never going to share our videos now.
I know. I see a lot of people saying the reason that disclosure has not happened is because they see the public would not be ready for it and there'd be mass hysteria and stuff like that. But I mean, like, you had a large population who didn't believe in a virus.
Yeah, the Brookings Institute had that whole report in like the 60s and 70s about this stuff, about basically saying that even if the government knew this stuff, it should never be disclosed because of what it would cause from a social and cultural disruption perspective. But yeah, Nick, I'm with you, man. Like, we don't even have consensus reality about, like, actually. Well, shit, yes, exactly. We are all living in like highly fractured realities right now. We're living in a post-truth era. Yeah, don't get me started on this. This is very upsetting.
So I usually ask, like, what what compelled us to consider the ETH or the NHI hypothesis in the first place, but what evidence is there to even hint or suggest that the government is withholding knowledge?
Well, I would say the evidence that the government is withholding knowledge is, I mean, it's simply a fact of history that the government withholds knowledge. So once again, we're sort of stepping into this territory of like, are UFOs real? Well, of course, anything that's unidentified in the sky can be UFO. Is the government withholding things? Yeah, all the time, certainly.
Sure.
On the subject of UFOs specifically, we actually have a huge body, a large body of long-standing, verified, not confrontational or challenging evidence that the government's done a ton of secret work on the study of UFOs to try to take it seriously and figure out what's going on. And we actually have those reports, and we have the conclusions of those reports, and we have the memos that led to the production of those reports. And the narrative that emerges is pretty coherent. It's pretty much exactly what you would think a government would do under conditions where they're trying to behave responsibly. It's exactly what occurred in the early 50s and onward. And, is it a conspiracy? I mean, there are conspiracies. Okay, so we mentioned briefly, maybe it was last week that the American government had sound listening devices in the Pacific Ocean for decades through the Cold War. And through those listening devices, they were top secret. They were able to pinpoint the exact location of the entire Soviet nuclear fleet. They kept that secret for decades.
We've had drones for like 60 years.
Yeah, but just that there are these programs with huge numbers of scientists backing it up, totally secret. And, we find out about it later when the effectiveness of the system wears off, or a variety of things. So there's a long history of governments doing things in the national security interests. And the idea, you got to take them to account. You got to make sure that they aren't abusing that power. But there's a long history of them doing this kind of stuff in secret because it's necessary in the interest of national security to do it that way.
But given that, can we reasonably suspect them of any conspiracy then? Or should there still be, something that kind of indicates one way or the other that led us to that conclusion?
Well, and there's fiction. This also presupposes this notion that the act of disclosure is solely within the hands of the government and not in the hands of other either cultural or religious or academic or private institutions, right? Like we're all walking around like, oh, it's the government's job to tell us this, but the reality is huge amounts. Particularly for our future and bleeding edge technology, is developed well outside the government's purview, right? The government's the one with like the bottomless pockets for this kind of stuff and skunkworks projects, but a ton of this stuff is happening with private contractors. It's happening, at Boeing, at Lockheed, etc. My point is that I think the presupposition that this exists within the hands of the government. In a lot of ways, I'm much more inclined to believe this exists in the hands of the Catholic Church, quite frankly, than the government, because as an organized collective institution with an extraordinary intellectual history, and extraordinary archives and resources and money and education, and everybody internally being in very deliberate lockstep with one another, like that seems to me much more compelling than like a 300-year-old country with a lot of guns and no socialized healthcare. Right? Like, I think it's way more compelling to say this kind of stuff may exist in the hands of the church. I'm not saying I agree with that, but I am saying that just from the perspective of this discussion, like, I'm not sure I'd even assign this purely to the government.
Right. I mean, that makes sense to me. It depends on what the origin of disclosure will be. What does it look like for there to be disclosure? Is it people just presenting personal accounts of what they've seen and done? Because we've had that enough times.
Dude, well, how extensive does the evidence actually have to be? By what institutions, both governmental, private, etc., like before there's actually common acceptance of this idea, right? Like we saw with COVID, dude, like germ theory isn't even accepted by huge portions of the population. Plus the sort of anti-intellectual, anti-elitist bent that's like super common, especially in America, Campbell.
Yeah.
This notion that like there is any institution or collective of institutions that could provide any kind of evidence of any caliber that would largely convince the human population, to me, is like, that ship has sailed. It just seems impossible to me at this point. I think we live in such a fractured reality, that there's basically no narrative that could be presented, even with extremely compelling evidence, that would be understood and believed by even a majority of the population.
Well, the UFO, sorry, I just want to say the UFO subject is weird in the sense that it's like maybe one of the only conspiracy cultures I could think of where the main goal is to like get the government to validate the views. Like it's just strange.
Do you think that at least in part comes from that idea that I talk about, where in our society we're accustomed to kind of instant gratification, and not only that, but always seeking an authority. And I think the UFO space kind of has a lack of a true authority because there's nothing.
Yeah, we need a daddy to hold our hand, man.
Right. So not only do we put some of these figures up on pedestals, these media figures, but we also kind of insist that the government is the authority and we demand the answer from them. I wonder if that's kind of like the push that's pushed disclosure around since at least the 50s, like Kehoe and stuff was whining about it that long ago. And it's always been kind of imminent and on that horizon for 70 plus years. And
what I mean, how much
we really don't know anything else.
How much does this entire arc mirror the sort of archetypes associated with like the redemption arc of Christ, right? Like there is something coming that is going to redeem us, that is going to explain everything, that is literally going to save us from ourselves, right? You see some of these narratives around like, oh, they would intervene if there was a nuclear attack, or they would intervene. Yes, we should definitely get drunk by a campfire sometime. I'm a lot of fun in those circumstances. We should do an INS CE5 excursion. I lost my train of thought. This is what happens when I have people commenting on stuff.
Yeah, UFOs, goddamn.
Whatever.
Yeah,
man.
whatever. Well, disclosure is redemption arc, right? This idea that like this is something that's coming to basically shoehorn us out of the absolutely miserable situation we've managed to put ourselves and the rest of humanity in.
Yeah.
Again, Nick, this is what you're talking about, right? This idea of the UFO daddy that swoops in, is the key authority and takes care of us, and that's it. But that's such a Christian idea. I say this as a Jew, right? Like that's such a Christian idea of like having this redemptive figure come in and fix stuff for you, instead of being like, nope, it is this world and we have to deal with it right here.
Interesting.
Yeah, the history of the subject as it's treated by the government certainly contradicts the core essence of the disclosure narrative. We have, for example, Roswell, the crash there is probably the central unifying moment in a lot of the modern UFO cultural psychology. And the government was pretty open about that in the 90s when they actually finally did an investigation into it, right? The Congress and stuff, they came out and was like, oh yeah, this is part of this top secret project. It's not a weather balloon because we were tracking weather. It's a much larger kind of balloon with a lot of like radar reflectors and all this stuff. And they got down to the point where the little icons that people were drawing from remembering seeing it on the pieces of material, like they were
on the I-beams,
traced back to the type of tape that was used by the scientists to put it together physically. Very compelling, and that's not accepted at all by the majority of this community that is looking for disclosure to happen. And so like there are these very deep contradictions where when you get something that could be said to be a kind of disclosure, i.e. originally like the base did say it was a flying saucer that crashed. Like looking back on it, it looks like maybe the intel officer and the commander panicked because they realized they had like a really top secret thing on their hands. Like I don't but it's like it sort of flips it around. And what do we do with that, where if disclosure day comes and then you just have a panel where people come out and sort of say things, validating certain beliefs, maybe rejecting others, it's not going to end with anything, and then there's just going to be an endless push forward, isn't there?
I've noticed that like another cry kind of tandem with disclosure is for science to either take this seriously or investigate it. And I want to know if either of you have any suggestions on how that would happen, because I kind of see the entirety of the UFO field as, witness testimony solely, right? We don't have any UFO residue or pieces, really. We don't have
flying saucer nests, Nick.
Yeah, any kind of physical evidence to this. So give this problem, this 70-year problem that we've kind of created, not that there's strict criteria for what these UFOs are, but like you have a scientist who's willing to look at this. What does this person do? What does this scientist do?
Right. And also, how do we bring in scientists and academics that aren't like totally brainwormed with like their preconceived, right? Yeah. I say this, like, I say this as the resident, like, wootard, basically, like, woo person. But like, how do we bring in people that like aren't, but also on the other side aren't so catastrophically welded to other particular outcomes that they're able to evaluate and thinking out loud here, I think the real way to do this is rather than is basically not just is through an interdisciplinary approach, but also through like a cross-functional exploration, right? Like you have multiple disciplines and thinkers in different fields represented to legitimize the study, right? Like, what does it actually mean to do this, right? Is it anthropologists? Is it folklorists? Is it atmospheric physicists? Who is it?
From my perspective, but like from the perspective of a truth seeker, a UFO believer, an experiencer, whatever you want to be called, what is it that anyone sees science doing? Like, does anyone in the chat have an idea either? Like, what are we doing?
Well,
are we just looking for patterns in witness reports? Like,
right. Because like, dude, if you asked me, like, I would say the process of like taking pictures of the atmosphere is like a fool's errand. We already know that there's unusual and strange atmospheric phenomena. We know that there's plasma. We know that there's Steve. We know that these things exist. That stuff is completely uninteresting and uncompelling to me at this point, because we've already established that even if we can't prove the existence of these phenomena to the standards of Western scientific empiricism, right? Like, we didn't know about ball lightning until like 10 years ago. But to me, it requires, to me, the really cool stuff would be if you could get the like Raymond Moody's of the world taking this kind of stuff seriously, like the guys who are studying like near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, and consciousness, right? Like what makes the mind or the brain behave and act in certain ways under particular circumstances. Because I just don't find the like material atmospheric physics stuff like there's already tons of evidence of this stuff, but like there's nothing necessarily mysterious about it. We know it exists, like the Hessdalen lights.
Well, what's a falsifiable hypothesis we can make about UFOs?
Nick, don't do this to me, man.
There's the null hypothesis.
Let me bring up ChatGPT.
No, but seriously, so I mean, and that would essentially be saying like these are explainable objects that we don't have enough information on, and you can look into those, and in some circumstances you can solve them. That's considered debunking. But I think that is the closest way you can treat the UFO problem with science is by using null hypothesis.
Right, by conventional science, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So I see it more of the demand for science is more of just a demand for another type of authority to say, yes, you're right. That's an alien. I confirm this. Right. More than actually like looking at it scientifically, in my opinion.
Right.
Well, the study within the government anyway, we can look at how they approached it, that it's worthwhile taking a look at that. They started collecting witness reports, and they started categorizing what people were reporting. And then in it was 51, if I recall correctly, they actually put a team of people out at Los Alamos with a variety of instruments, though they didn't provide adequate budgeted funding for all of the instruments that were requested, to stake out the nuclear lab where they had scientists reporting observations of green fireballs and things of that nature that were behaving strangely. And they did their report, Project Twinkle. And what it said was, it seems that there's something being observed. Dr. Kaplan, he's one of the nuclear physicists, believes that they're natural phenomena. And then they say, we're taking a serious look at the idea of fireballs, which encompass a wide variety of atmospheric phenomena, including meteor coming in and ball lightning and things like that. They say we're taking a serious look at this stuff because we're worried that the Russians are ahead of us on it. And so that's why they're taking it seriously. And they say we haven't made a conclusive determination. What we have determined is that the sightings, when we're actually staking it out, are at a much reduced rate than when the reports are just coming in without people staking it out. And there seemed to be this sort of set of features that people are consistently reporting, but we can't verify that exists. So they went out there with optical instruments. They were trying to get a shot of the things. So they started with that perspective in mind, to like sit there and try to like get a photo. And that's something that we see continuing into the public sphere when we start looking at the origins of private investigations. And the first one that was longstanding was a Project Identification, started by Professor Harley Rutledge out of University of Southeast Missouri, if I recall correctly. I believe he was a solid state physicist. He staked out a UFO flap for a couple of years, wrote a book, I believe it was called Project Identification. He reported very similar objects to what had been reported previously. And then we have Hesdalen, famously or infamously, Professor Erling Strand. They ended up doing long-term surveys there, and the descriptions were again similar. And then at Hesdalen, we actually had him as, what was the first guest on our show because of me, Dr. Massimo Teodorani.
Because of you, Campbell.
I know.
You slid into his DMs and you asked him out. I'm so glad you did.
Darn, I got him on like 4 or 5 shows like in 1 year there because I was determined.
You were on Out of the Blank with him too recently?
A while ago, yeah. And UCR, or was he on UCR? He was on Singularity Lab. He was scheduled to be on UCR. So he was around. But anyway, and he, astrophysicist, he was there for a few years in the early 2000s, wrote a paper, a long-term scientific survey of the Hesdalen light phenomenon. It was published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, which is it is peer-reviewed, but it produces a variety of
It's not
papers.
gold standard, but it's not the worst either.
It's not a natural science.
Yes.
Yeah. It's not natural science. It's sort of like paranormal phenomena stuff. Anyway, his reports describes very similar characteristics, but then he says the most probable explanation for a number of these observations in an electrochemical model for ball lightning. And then he cites a variety of the papers over the last couple of years that demonstrate the plausibility mechanistically of an object like that occurring. And then in the decade and a half after that, then we had wide variety of replicable experiments showing a plurality of different ways of producing ball lightning phenomena in lab scenarios in normal atmospheric conditions that would exist in nature. And then we have the 2014 optical and spectral characteristics of ball lightning published in Physical Review Letters, where they actually got
Campbell listening to you whisper this in my ears, man.
Am I whispering? Yeah, just talk. The optical yeah, but it all so there is this sort of consistent theme where there are this core observations. It's reminding me of a few of the memos from the CIA relating to the Washington 1952 DC flyover events in July, when they're bunch of memos, and they talk about actually maybe I'll just share the screen and I can show you, but it's like they describe what they're looking for, and it's similar to Dr. J. Allen Hynek when he describes exactly what he believes as the core residual of cases with a common set of features. Let's see here, share, here we go. So this is the memos, Computer UFO Network got them. And here we go. Let's see. I just took them out of there, but you can go through. So let's see here. Grouped broadly as visual radar, combined visual radar. 2 major classes. First, spherical or elliptical, usually bright or metallic luster. Some small, estimated, most estimated 100 feet. let's see here. There are variants such as torpedoes, triangulars, pencils, even mattress shapes. These are all daylight reportings. The second visual group, all night reporting, consists of lights and various luminosities such as green, flaming red, or blue-white fireballs, moving points of light, and luminous streamers. And then it says no debris or material evidence has ever been recorded. So they are describing something. They're describing these lights. When we look at modern reports, we see something very similar, descriptions of these lights. When we go to other memos and documents from inside the government, they're describing something very similar. And if I can just find Dr. Hynek's descriptions, here we go. Yeah, his descriptions. The same classification. And I don't think this was in 72 when he published this. I'm pretty sure that these CIA memos were not yet actually released. I believe it was in 79 that got released. So he actually created a classification distinct from the secret CIA that is identical. So he goes, nocturnal lights, daylight discs. So then he describes at night, only the brightness, color, and motion of a light are reported. Rarely is the object noted to which the light is presumably attached. This is purely an assumption. The UFO may be nothing more than the light. And, it just goes on. But it's like these objects, it's not a flying saucer that you think of. It's a uniformly glowing light of various colors that exhibits the features that people say the, spaceships are doing. So, so when we're looking at disclosure, what do we do with that, right? Like, you then,
right. Well, what was the reaction to any of these reports from the government about UFOs? They weren't trusted, right?
Yes.
It's only the one that confirms your suspicions that you're going to believe. Like, you have to reflect on that and be kind of aware.
Yes, absolutely. And sorry, go on.
Did either of you see that Twitter poll I did a couple of weeks ago?
Was this the one about like what people actually think UFOs are, or like what percentage
this was
anomalous?
It was I said what percentage of reported cases do you think are misidentifications or hoaxes? I think I and a lot of people think like hoaxes are a very small percentage.
Yes, agreed.
I mean, like they get a lot of publicity and stuff. Like they don't make up very many reported cases. So like. I got about 400 replies, which, isn't like a huge sample size, but we are talking about not a huge community. And the majority of the answers were somewhere between 80 to like 95 to 99%. Meanwhile, these these weren't just skeptic responses. I've got friends on all sides of this, and they all kind of agree. There's a consensus between everyone. Like the majority of these are misinterpretations, misidentifications. But I think there's some kind of disconnect when the UFO proponents are saying this. And I did follow up with this. How does that make you feel about witness testimony? Since the majority, if not, the overwhelming majority of the data in this field is witness testimony. I mentioned this in regard to that hearing with Kirkpatrick, where the majority of these reports being reported by service members, these trained witnesses, are of misidentified things. It really illustrates how easy this is to happen. Like people don't have, a good look at things in 20/20 vision constantly. You know what I mean? Like you cannot get good looks at things and your brain kind of fills it in. If it's so simple, how can we, on one hand, say 90% of these are misidentifications, but we need scientists to look at this data, but it's all witness testimony. Like witness testimony only gives us the witness's interpretation of the event, not the reality of it, but it also is subject to change over time, to exaggerate over time. I've shown privately you two an example of this over the last 20 years, a witness testimony changing. It was a personal conversation with a witness, so I don't want to show it on here or anything. But Campbell, you recall this, right? Had to do with lights being seen and how they were depicted later via CGI, if you recall. I don't want to get too far into that.
Okay, yeah, no, I remember.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Yeah, you're
so,
fine.
Yeah, we have one of the most imperfect forms of data that's not only subject to interpretation but subject to change over time. Witness testimony, yeah. But that's all we have. So like, how would science work with that? From this standpoint, you give this to a new scientist, like I was saying earlier. What are we doing here? What's the What do you do with it? And why does this kind of circles back to the beginning? What is the purpose of ufology?
Mm-hmm.
Why do we do it? Because what I see ufology as is less of a academic thing or a science, and more of a fandom, honestly. And I don't mean to be insulting, but it's a community of content consumption, watching UFO documentaries, reading UFO books. It's all this content consumption, and then that makes me wonder what we're doing. Are we feeding the fire by creating UFO content?
How do we ethically engage with this subject? Yeah.
Are we feeding the meme? Are we feeding the tulpa?
Mm-hmm.
I think
yes,
it depends.
We
it
are.
Depends on the episode, eh? Yeah.
Should we be?
Right. This was something. This was something I talked about a lot with Lou Jimenez one-on-one. He and I talked a lot about sort of the ethics of engaging in this kind of subject. I mean, this is something. I mean, I come at this in my research and writing on Art Bell and Coast to Coast AM. This is something I struggle with immensely, because art was phenomenally formative for me, both as a media figure and an intellectual figure and cultural figure, but also he laid the foundation of this sort of conspiratorial broadcloth that now blankets huge swaths of American culture and politics. Like, he was the springboard for Alex Jones. He was the springboard for Jimmy Church and a lot of these characters. And like, how do I do these things simultaneously, right? Like, we're grown-ups, we're able to have complex thoughts and engage with and think about things in a sophisticated fashion. But like, how do I engage and think about something that was personally so significant and so valuable to me, and understand it, while also being deeply critical about the long-term repercussions of this media figure, and how it has encroached on and deeply, deeply affected huge parts of our political and social experience in this country, right? Like, how can these two things be considered at the same time? And similarly, like, how do we talk about this subject and engage with it in good faith, right? Not as cynics, not as detractors, not as individuals denigrating the subject or experiencers or anything else. How do we engage with this in good faith while also being discerning about the ideas and concepts that we legitimize, right? Like, I think we do have responsibilities. I don't want to say collectively, because I do think it's important to emphasize we're not monolithic here, but I do think we have an INS responsibility, and I certainly feel an individual responsibility to make appropriate prioritization about this subject. And what I mean by this is to not prioritize this subject over views, actions, and ideas that I otherwise find abhorrent, right? Like,
so
ufology is not a trump card.
Chat is what you're saying?
Yeah, or maybe like Tucker Carlson really sucks, right? Like, maybe Tucker Carlson sucks and we shouldn't be retweeting his show or whatever just because Gary Nolan's on it. I don't know. It's so complicated because it's a subject I care deeply about, and am personally and intellectually so invested in, but also I struggle with being engaged with in so many different levels as well. And I'm with you, dude. It is largely a community of content consumption, but that's like basically everything in the world. I mean, my personal approach is I only really engage with other people on this subject if they're either experiencers and talk to me a lot about their stuff. Cool, great, love to hear it, want to talk about it. Or if they are similar creators or thinkers in this space. I've generally taken the approach of like not engaging with the oi polloi of people who just want to like blast out their shitty opinions all over everything.
I don't heard that term before, oi polloi.
Yeah, like the common folk.
Proletariat, Leah.
No, I love the proletariat. This is more like the lumpen proletariat, right? not the proletariat themselves.
What do you think, Campbell? You've been quiet for a minute.
Gosh, what I think. I think that my perspective is that I want to treat this kind of like the history of natural philosophy. I think Dr. Hynek, as we know, he was the chief consultant for the Project Blue Book for the U.S. Air Force and the chairperson of Northwest University's astronomy department, professor there. He frequently cited meteorites as a very important thing that we should learn from, the discovery of meteorites as a natural phenomenon. In 1803, there was something called the L'Aigle, L'Aigle, meteor fall in France, where a meteor exploded in the air and thousands of fragments rained down. That was considered the turning point when the National Academies of Science finally accepted that stones could fall from the sky, even though there was no sufficient plausible explanation for how the stones would be in the sky. They knew about gravity. It wouldn't make any sense for the stones to be up there. There was no compelling explanation for why they would be up there. Therefore, you discount the claims coming mostly from people in the countryside and things like that. Now, if we were going out there and picking up all these accounts from the people in the countryside, they would be saying that they saw angels. They would be saying we've seen them. And if we, as natural philosophers, were saying, well, there's some compelling papers out of the French National Academy of Sciences that suggest that something called a vacuum could exist, and maybe this is evidence for that. And then those people are taking us being like, we think you might have actually seen what you saw. And then they're saying these people are verifying that we saw angels. I mean, what do you do with that, right? Like, and then a couple of years later, it's like, oh, okay, they're actually all these, thousands or whatever of people actually saw these things. And, there's no satisfaction for those people. And then they're still insisting that they saw angels, I imagine. I don't think that the decision of that's actually an interesting disclosure. Like the National Academy of Science in 1803 come out and say, oh, the ethereal beings, the pure light beings are real.
Oh, yes.
The extraterrestrials are real. They aren't living, but we now believe that those things are being seen. I mean, that's a huge pivot. And I think Hynek was right that there is a lesson that can be drawn there. Because if we only take the observations, there's a fairly compelling way of putting it all together that suggests that something very similar may occur in this subject. And I feel the same thing is going to occur. That didn't eliminate the belief in angels whatsoever. So I don't think that it's going to eliminate the belief in UFOs as a distinct thing whatsoever, even if science conclusively verifies that these phenomena exhibit all of the features that were attributed to, the UFOs that are spaceships. If, we can conclusively get on a high resolution video a ball lightning phenomenon exhibiting these features, which we have not gotten a conclusive high resolution video of the ball lightning actually doing all of these things people describe.
Right.
So, they exist, but we don't have that exact thing. But even when we have that thing, we already have papers that were published by Dr. Vallée, in like I think it was 2003 with Dr. Eric Davis, where they already say, we think that the UFOs are mimicking real natural phenomenon. And so there is always going to be this sort of pushing forward of the narrative, and it's going to escape us no matter what we do. So it's an interesting point. I think there's value in the traditional natural philosophy skeptical approach. Skepticism has always traditionally been completely aligned with naturalization, trying to explain observations through natural means. And, I think that there is value in doing that with this subject. Well, Nick, what about you? Do you think that we're doing more harm than good? What's your thought?
I'm not going to say that we're harming anyone, or otherwise I wouldn't be here. I don't know. I don't know. I don't see ufology or the UFO community changing ever. There's always going to be things in the air that we can't see because, like I said, they're fleeting and out of reach. I don't think any, authority figure coming out and saying, no, these are all misidentifications is going to do any good. And while the finer details and the kind of qualities and features of the UFOs might change with society, like we're seeing it do now, where it's becoming more, I'm trying to think of another word besides wooey, but it's becoming more wooey, in my opinion. The kind of
it's becoming more like subjective, basically.
So actually, yeah, here's an example. UFOs haunting people, I think, is kind of a, well, no, there was a bit of that during the abduction period of the 80s and 90s. There was like repeat abductors and family lines and bloodlines being abducted and stuff like that. But I'm talking about more, the space poltergeist kind of aspect of it.
The curse of the mummy.
Hitchhiker effect.
Yeah. So I see little changes like that, kind of like how, right after Sputnik, we started seeing them interfering with our cars. And before those like sensationalist newspaper articles about the foreign armies raids that stop tanks and stuff like that. So I think people always kind of like put our ideas of modernity on these things, near modernity. Yes. But otherwise, it'll always be the same. Man. I think there will always be new figures to take in that authority vacuum. I think people will always misidentify things. And the whole story of NHI coming in crafts and visiting us and abducting us or observing us and the government knowing is so ingrained in our culture. I tell you guys this all the time. I watch old compilations of commercials from like the 80s and 90s. I just put that on.
God. Nick, you are so cool.
I watch it on this.
You watch it on the CRT?
Yeah, I have a Roku attached to it that I run through.
Oh my God.
But anyway,
you are such a type of guy. It's incredible. I love it.
The best type.
Yeah, the best type of guy, to be clear.
But my point in bringing that up is that in every compilation, there's at least one commercial that features a flying saucer with aliens coming out of it. Every single one. Car commercials have done this, cereal commercials, everything. It's part of our culture. TV shows, TV episodes.
They're priming us for disclosure, Nick.
Right. It's that slow drip. But like I said, I don't think that that's true, because who's doing that? Who's this cabal that's kind of like dictating what's in commercials, but also like works on the crash team retrieval unit at the government? Like, that doesn't make sense. That would involve so many people actually already knowing that essentially disclosure already happened.
Yeah.
Well, didn't our friend, didn't Mr. Elizondo say that disclosures already happened? Like, didn't he say something like that?
Well, like, this goes back to the question of like, what even constitutes disclosure, right? Is it just acknowledgement that things happen that we don't know about or can identify? Then yes, it's definitely happened.
Sure.
Right.
I just, that's the other thing. And I think I've brought this up in maybe every episode, but the fuzzy language that we all use, like no one's on the same page with any of this stuff. Like a definition of disclosure, what people think a UFO is, or what anyone thinks UFOs are real means. You can get a million different interpretations out of that phrase. And some people think that, that is, basically disclosure, when other people realize like, well, yeah, duh.
Or disclosure only happens when they have explicitly disclosed these 5 things. Right.
Here we go. This sounds like some vague wishy-washy bullshit that doesn't actually mean anything too.
Wait, who wrote this?
Disclosure's already happened, but it's also coming, and it's a marathon and not a race, and we're nowhere near it, and we're in the 5th gear, and
we can only asymptotically approach it, but can never actually intersect.
Right. We're all Sisyphus, I guess.
I
don't know. I feel like I don't think there's anything left in my brain to say about UFOs anymore. I think I've spit it all out tonight, finally.
I love it, Nick.
Yeah.
And this is good because, like, we've sort of been talking about broadening the horizon of the show, right? Like, branching off of UFOs, getting more into, like, the weird studies space. I mean, very candidly, just personally, I think weird studies people are maybe a bit more well-adjusted and less psychotic than a lot of the UFO people I've met.
That sounds nice.
Yeah, it sounds really nice. I love engaging with like relatively normal, well-socialized humans. But also, as I've said time and time again, like my approach to this subject is largely metaphysical, spiritually emergent, psychedelic, etc. And like I would love to talk more about parapsychology and psi phenomena and ghosts and things like that. I finally, I can't believe Jay Shank isn't here. Like that, I swear to God. Oh, he got crappy sleep last night, so he took a rain check. But he'll be back soon. He's like basically almost like an honorary INS guy at this point.
What about
Friend of the show.
Jack or Vanessa? Did either of them show up?
Both of them had plans. I know.
What is this,
Unbelievable,
Wednesday night?
right? On Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern. I know, incredible. We'll have them all
I'm
back
buying
on
that.
soon.
We're up against some kind of sky watching live stream, I believe.
That happens right after us.
Oh, it's after?
That's the WUFO Wednesday with the Weird Studies guys. We're kind of like the foreplay for that, I think. You basically go out and try to do CE5 with like the other podcast nerds.
Very nice.
But
Last week we were up against Trump on CNN. So.
Oh yeah, that was harsh.
Oh man, I was up against not having internet, so which actually pretty much ruled. Anyway, I digress. So I was talking about Jay because Jay just finished The Trickster and the Paranormal by Gregory Hansen. If people have not read this, definitely read it. I'm working on it right now. So first of all, it is like, I had no idea how dense it was. It's basically like a 500-page academic paper. Very dense, very good. I feel like I'm like making notes on every page. But like he proposes this idea basically that like basically as the presence and daily involvement with structures exist in modern life, like as we increasingly have like well-defined systems that run our lives, everything from like traffic to how we do our work to like the predictability of our home environments, like this kind of like these structures and systems kind of crowd out the opportunity to have like these liminal or strange experiences. And he sees the liminal or strange experiences, and he sort of treats like the range of paranormal or supernatural things all sort of as a collective artifact of like one phenomena, right? UFOs, telekinesis, clairvoyance, whatever. And basically that like as we converge towards this increasingly structured experience and culture and society, that like again it marginalizes and removes these experiences from daily life, like they become much more marginal. But that as we see the breakdown of these structures, even in modern society, one of the examples he draws upon is the collapse of the Soviet Union and the subsequent rise in popular interest in the paranormal and psychics and mediumship and things like that. Like basically as these structures decay, it increasingly opens space for experiences and perceptions and beliefs that are I don't want to say logically inconsistent, but do not cohere to the structures of daily life.
I see. Yeah, that's an interesting thought.
Well, that's really interesting with respect to the Soviet Union, especially because philosophically they were, all purely atheistic from their enculturation, hardcore materialists, physicalists, and I understand that throughout. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say I'm messaging you guys in the private chat an article by Hannah Gay called Psychic Healing at the End of History, which is all about the post-Soviet obsession with like psychics on television after the collapse of the Soviet Union. If you posted it there in case you want to post it in the comments. Anyway, sorry, Campbell.
No, yeah, that's a valid point. And there was a dramatic interest or extreme interest in the Soviet Union related to all of these kinds of phenomena. And I mean, it's quite interesting because obviously the Soviet Union was a criminal, evil empire, but they were actually studying these things, taking them more seriously in some ways. And according to our own declassified documents from our governments, we see that our intelligence agencies were worried about playing catch up on some of these things. So, for example, psychic phenomena, the Soviets were investigating it before the CIA. The CIA was trying to catch up to the Soviets because they were worried that the Soviets were onto something. The Soviets were studying it from a physicalist, materialist perspective. They were studying it from the perspective of like electromagnetism and things like that. They were trying to determine them from a scientific perspective if they were real or not. And, that also extends into UFOs. There are massive databases of universities in the former Soviet Union about ball lightning. It's like one of them contains like 10,000 reports. And when you go through those reports, they are literally identical to UFO reports, except for the interpretation In the Soviet Union, you have physics papers describing fluid dynamics, doing the math, showing after an observation how the object is exactly behaving, how you can cause an object to behave under the influence of magnetic forces. And so, you know, there is this natural physical approach that was occurring there. And then the Western, it sounds a little bit, I mean, it is conspiratorial, but the declassified documents that we have, especially the one from the United Kingdom from 2000, where they're getting into it, they talk specifically, we're quite concerned that the Soviet Union is ahead of us on the study of ball lightning. We are certain that UFOs exist. This is the United Kingdom's military intelligence. We're certain UFOs exist. We are almost certain they are natural atmospheric phenomena. We need to study these things because we are worried that due to stigma associated with UFOs, we have not been looking at them closely enough, and we think there's a variety of technological advancements that can be achieved by understanding ball lightning better. So that, you know, this is their document, they wrote it out, and they could be wrong about that. That's just an interpretation as well. But you see that there was this hardcore atheist materialist philosophy in the Soviet Union that led to them actually trying to naturalize these phenomena. And you see in the historical documentary record that we have in our national archives that our intelligence agencies were consistently trying to play catch up.
It's interesting that they still kind of considered that there would be a mysterious explanation for like a representative number of these cases rather than just people misidentifying things. Which is what I see as the common factor. But
yeah, I just want to validate what you're saying, Nick. Like, it's extremely important to remember. Steve Long said it in the chat earlier that most of the time when there's something extraordinary being claimed to exist, it almost always is not ultimately found to be real. And so we can't assume that, you know, extraordinary claims result in extraordinary realities, you know, or whatever. I'm messing up the quote, but
we can accept that with you know, convincing evidence with corroborative evidence.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? I'm not against these extraordinary claims, but it's going to take a bit for me to believe it, other than, you know, kind of an intuitional belief based on just the culture I was raised in.
Well, and I said this last week, but Occam's razor, that was created by William of Ockham, a friar in the 14th century who created it to argue that miracles probably exist. It's the simplest explanation for the fact that you're having common experiences being reported across time and place of similar things. And so it's like, because there's so many people reporting something similar, you know, discreetly, then it's reasonable to infer that it's actually real. And that's what Occam's razor originally was. It's that miracles are real. We know now that's not verified. That's not supported by the evidence. And then we can do the Virgin Mary as well. You know, hundreds upon hundreds of very intensely investigated reports by the Catholic Church over centuries. And, you know, we don't have evidence for that either. So you're absolutely right, Nick. Like, there's a good prospect that there isn't an actual real thing at the heart of many of these reports, or any of them.
It brings me back to why we have a ufology and why we don't have a lost sockology. And I think
because
the big
socks are cheap and the sports model is expensive, Nick.
Well, because we can eventually find the socks and then hold them again. You know, we can't catch a UFO. It's gone. It's already in the past. We just have our memory of it. And that's what we want to give to science and politicians to hold up and validate for us, as everybody's just stories and memories.
Oh, Nick.
I'm becoming a cynic again. Sorry.
I'll see it. This doesn't seem, I mean, I guess there's a flavor of this that could be very cynical, but none of this pings as deeply cynical to me. I mean,
why? Because it's really all true.
Well, no, now, but because I think particularly when people have experiences that break apart their ontologies, and especially when they're isolated in this experience, which is very common because we have such poor cultural narratives for interpreting and metabolizing these kinds of things, whether UFOs or Bigfoot or emergence or whatever. These are deeply isolating and traumatizing events for many, many people. And the idea that they can be seen and recognized and validated by external powers of authority, right? Whether it's friends or family or doctors or politicians or whatever, like this is in many respects deeply important for sort of the individual like, I don't want to say the healing process, but like how we metabolize and integrate these experiences. Like being heard and being witnessed is deeply powerful for people, especially when they feel very isolated after something that is extraordinary.
Or interpreted as extraordinary. Yeah.
Yes.
We got like 9 minutes for a final thought.
Well, I mean, what Leah was just saying, I can relate to in some ways. I've talked here and there about it, but I sometimes have hypnopompic sleep hallucinations. It's when you wake up and for 5 to 10 seconds, the sleeping hallucinatory state does not completely shut off. It's just a slight disconnect there, usually associated with a stressful experience during the day or whatever. But, you know, my first experience where I acknowledged that, or I recognized that something weird was happening. I was like 13, 14 and woke up and I saw, I mean, it's such a classic one, but like what looked like a metallic sphere thing floating in my bedroom when I woke up. I thought it was like a robot or something. I was like really into Star Wars. I was like, what the heck? That looks like the torture droid from Star Wars. What?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And then yes, it looked kind of like that without the projections or anything. But, you know, the internet existed. I'm young enough that I got up and I went straight to Google and just typed in what I experienced. And then I immediately found a sufficient explanation. But I also look back on it and I think if I did not have access to that, if I couldn't like figure out exactly immediately what I had seen, a couple hundred years prior, I would be convinced that I was being like visited by demons or something.
Nearly every culture around the world has its own like slightly unique specific superstition based around sleep paralysis. Old hags, kabashinari in Japan, I think that's how you say it. Like every culture's got some kind of entity that comes and kind of like explains the sensations of a hypnopompic or hypnagogic hallucination, along with the paralysis and the kind of pushing on the chest. The Japanese call it the choking ghost. You know, the term haggard comes from being visited by the old hag, which was an old superstition about sleep paralysis. I mean, it left you tired in the morning, so you were haggard.
Yeah.
But
right.
But like, think about that. It's a natural thing that people didn't explain or couldn't explain at the time, and they've created a folklore around it, and it just became kind of a subconsciously known by everybody culturally.
Yeah. Well, and it's an interpretive framework that allows them to metabolize and integrate the experience, right? It gives them a language to talk about it. It gives them a framework to understand what happened, even if it's not pleasant, right? We don't even have this shit anymore, right? The only places you find this kind of stuff is like if you're deep into the like weird Buddhist shit that I'm into, like you're gonna have language and interpretive frameworks for like when you basically have psychedelic experiences in meditation or like, but like if I went and talked to like the standard issue doctor or therapist about this, they'd be totally pathologize it, right? Like at least having these, even if it's something that we understand from a scientific perspective now, like having these cultural frameworks to integrate these experiences historically are deeply powerful. And again, I think a major reason is because it upends that sense of isolation or freakishness that can accompany, these unique encounters.
Are you guys familiar at all with Mandela effects?
Oh yeah.
This kind of meme that's
there's
a lot of
bears and stuff.
Bizarre things trending on TikTok, but this is almost a new one, right? This is almost a new kind of.
It's a new meme.
It's coming out over like kind of collective and cultural memories of thing, like saying, "Luke, I am your father." Vader's line. He wouldn't say that in the line. He says, "No, I'm your father," because it's part of a sentence. But if you isolate that to kind of convey that same scene without the dialogue on either end, you say, "Luke."
Yeah, that's how the scene is conveyed in every other place except the movie.
So now we have a superstition that once again kind of revolves around alternate dimensions or alternate places, almost the ether again, because we're switching between these things. I think that pop science magazines and blogs kind of play into that too. we've talked about that a little bit too, where like you'll get these like highly theoretical physical ideas getting tossed around on blogs saying like scientists baffled by something that exceeds the brightness that we previously maximum. So like all these like kind of pop that sound really interesting, and they're kind of sci-fi and they're weird and they're really out there. They're non-applicable, but you're serving this to a population that doesn't have, you know, a basic science understanding, a science education to even like interpret this kind of stuff. So I think that stuff just kind of propagates too. You know what I mean?
I mean, we get. Oh, go ahead.
That just kind of feeds into the idea, and it gives it more places for these superstitions to hide. Because like we always talked about, aliens came from Mars, then from Venus, then the dark side of the moon. But we started, you know, sending probes there and landers.
Zeta Reticuli.
George Adamski said he saw the backside of the moon before we sent any imaging back there, and said that there were cities. But then, you know, our kind of cultural understanding grew, so they have to hide further and further. And I think these pop science articles and stuff kind of give people, because they talk about multiverses and things like that, highly hypothetical, like I said, non-falsifiable things, really just kind of pop science. But then people consume that and it becomes part of the lore. The lore is always changing. I mean, and that's why we see constant different features with UFOs. Like I said, now they're the space ghost version of UFOs that can haunt people. It's just a new feature. They're not really abducting people anymore. Campbell says they are, but
Campbell's got some weird beliefs about this stuff.
Yeah. No, hey, it's coming directly from the UK Ministry of Defense. Or I mean, it's not me. Let me just as a final little note about disclosure, because we haven't really touched on it too much, but Blue Book led into the Condon report, which was the United States Air Force finally was like, okay, we need to stop like bringing in these reports. We aren't getting any information. Let's get a panel of university experts on that. They, you know, right now we have the UAP study group in NASA. They're doing essentially something similar, at least the preliminary stages. So maybe I'd love to just bring this up. It's just a little segment from my website, but the University of Colorado and U.S. Air Force Scientific Study of Unidentified Flying Objects, aka the Condon Report. So the entire chapter 7. So this is what, okay, my opinion, if we're going to get disclosure, this is sort of like they're gonna maybe do a repeat of what they've already done, because it worked. It sort of made it go away and stuff. So let's see, a disclosure tonight. Let's look at the Colorado Condon Report, Chapter 7, Atmospheric Electricity and Plasma Interpretations of UFOs. So I got a whole chapter here, and then they just go into the descriptions of ball lightning. Like they conclude the objects with these features, I think they're ball lightning. They even go into how they think electric fields might be related and might be having physiological effects on people. That's not verified even now, but even then they were saying that. Yada, yada, collisions with aircraft. So you got this. So then we got the National Academy of Sciences review of the University of Colorado report on unidentified flying objects. So the National Academy of Sciences did a review of the report to give an independent interpretation of what happened. And their conclusions were, there are important areas of atmospheric electricity in which present knowledge is quite incomplete. These topics came to our attention in connection with the interpretation of some UFO reports. Research efforts are being carried out in these areas by the Department of Defense and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And that's how they concluded it. So they don't say like, oh, UFOs are real or aren't real, but the report says like, well, we don't know, but you know, there are these objects. They have every quality that people are attributing to these objects, and you know, here's the independent review by the National Academy of Sciences, and they're saying these are the important areas, and they are actually already being investigated by the DoD and NASA. So I mean, is that disclosure? I don't know. It's kind of disclosure. It's the kind of disclosure that we're probably headed for.
There is no objective disclosure. It's all subjective to each person based on whichever flavor of UFOs they like the most.
Yes.
I don't know. Actually, it's coming soon.
Always soon.
It's coming tomorrow.
I've been told this year, big things.
I've been told tonight. That's what I heard.
That's just our show.
It was just clickbait, man.
Yeah. Tongue in cheek. Yeah.
So we're at the bottom of the hour.
Yeah, I'm tired, man.
I need my beauty sleep.
Yeah, well, let's wrap it up. I am not going to be here next week. I guess, do you guys have any plans? Yeah,
bantering with Lewis?
Gonna have to figure it out.
I'm gonna slide into some DMs this week and see who I can rope into a conversation. Maybe grab Jay or Vanessa. Nick, let's you and I coordinate. I'd love to do like some dude, let's talk about JB Ryan and the Duke Parapsychology Lab. That would be a cool subject.
We really should. I need to brush up on a lot of that because it has been, aside from that little excursion we did in episode 4 or whatever the hell it was, it's been years. I got to brush up. I got a couple of books. Stacey Horn's Unbelievable. I got the,
good.
What's it called? Parapsychology, Controversial Science, I think, which also goes
sitting in my Amazon cart. Supposed to be like the one. Yes.
Yeah, definitely worth digging into those. The fun times, flawed experiments, but cool, kooky stories and stuff like that. And like academia taking weird stuff seriously for a bit. I mean, there was a brief period from, I think, 2 different schools where you could get degrees in parapsychology. I think
Jeffrey Mishlove has one.
I think
Lloyd Arbach and Jeff Mishlove. Yes.
Incredible.
So cool.
Incredible. I hope they can do something with it, But I mean, like, what do you do with any degree? I wouldn't know. Don't ask me. I'm the high school dropout. But anyway, I have just been spitting about UFOs for too long, and I don't know.
And Duncan, dude, I would love to bring him on. I like EXO quite a bit. I'm reading some of the comments here.
There we go.
Yeah.
Don't get. That's
wrong comment.
No. Yeah.
Wrong comment. Would love to chat with him. Think highly of him. Appreciate his a whole lot of what he says.
Do I know that person?
I'm not sure he's an INS guest candidate, thanks to these degenerates that I hang out with. Not you, Nick. I'm talking about Lewis, currently suspended from Twitter for like the 5th time.
It's all for a good cause.
Yeah, he just called someone a gimp.
Yeah, oh God. Well, never mind that. Damn it.
Incredible. All right.
All right. Yep. I'm not
everybody.
Currently working on anything. I'm reading that book that just came out recently. That's
that 700-page one.
Yeah, The Reliability of UFO Witness Testimony, I think is what it's called. It's got that.
Yes.
It's a collection of essays by a bunch of people. It's free to download.
Yes.
The whole thing. It's really cool so far. I mean, I have some comments on the first little bit of it, but little nitpicks. Whatever.
Write them down.
Cool. And it's free. Read it. Why not?
Yes.
Read
free
a
on
book.
the internet.
Mm-hmm.
All right, everybody. Well, that's another week in UFO land. I hope you had a good time watching.
All right. We'll see you all next Wednesday.
Here we go.
Later.
See ya.